I was taught early on that it's the journey that counts, not the destination, which I think is true. And well, I think they've been important. If you come from a tiny little island and the moment you realise it's not very big, you tend to want to travel. I think the English like travelling, and but I didn't start till I was 21 when I first left England, and ever since I've been a gypsy, really. I think it would have been hard, actually. I think, well, in a way, you remain close to your home. If you didn't leave it for 20 years and you go away. I mean, I always look at Southern California because for 20 years you spent your life in a rather black, rainy, dismal city with low clouds over it all the time. Consequently, Southern California looks a special place to me. If you were born here, obviously, maybe you look at it differently. But that's because you take, you see, you take your home away with you. You do.
Why don't we begin by describing the place that you were born? Will you describe Yorkshire for us? What's the landscape like compared, for example, to your surroundings here in California?
Well, it's extremely green compared to California, but the cities, the industrial cities, are really very ugly. When I lived in Bradford, it was still mostly a Victorian city. Then they hadn't done any, they didn't start pulling things down till about 1955, I think, 10 years after all. And it's changed quite a bit now. It looks like the middle of Cologne or anywhere else, actually. But the countryside is very beautiful. It's a lot of parts of it are very pastoral, parts of it are very wild looking. I mean, the moors are very wild. Just a few miles away is, you can walk there from where we lived, is Haworth, where the Brontes wrote their novels. And the moors over there, they seem, in a way, once you've walked a few miles into them, they seem as wild and as remote as Death Valley does.
How do you think your work might have been different if you remained on that tight little island?
Well, I think it's hard to get into colour if you live there. The English are not great colourists, because unless they leave, when they leave, they're better, because you don't see any colour. I think it's they're very good at greys.
Are you suggesting that your palette has changed since you moved here?
Yeah, oh, it did, yeah, it did. I mean, at first it got simply brighter. I mean, there were pastel colours at first. But then it got stronger and stronger. Yeah, it's the light and what you see around you, does it?
What brought you to California for the first time?
I came here on a hunch, in a way. Just a hunch that I'd like it. I'd never been before. I went to New York in 1961, and I thought that was wonderful. But somehow or other, I had this vision of California from the movies. I suppose a lot of it was from movies, actually. And but you never quite knew what it looked like, because the movies don't really tell you what it looks like. Oddly enough, they make all the movies here, but they never really, hardly any movies tell you what Los Angeles is like. But I kept seeing pictures of palm trees and things, and I thought, that sounds like the place for me. And I came here once, the first time I came here, I just came, I thought I'd come and paint for a year. I thought I had enough money to live for a year without doing anything else, and I thought I would go to California. And people tried to put me off. In New York, they tried to put me off, especially Los Angeles. I couldn't drive. They said, if you can't drive, you can't get anywhere. And I said, oh, it doesn't matter. I should buy a bicycle. which I did.
Is that how you got around it?
I learned to drive, but the hunch was right. That somehow it was when I came here was the first time I ever started looking at the place you lived in. You see, in London, I was put off London painting it because every English art student was painting London, and they always painted it in a certain style, in a way that was derived from Sickert. I don't know if you know an English artist, Sickert, yes. And that style derived from Degas and Lautrec in a way. But there were too many ghosts, you see, and I thought, well, in California there won't be any. Even I've never seen any pictures of Los Angeles. I don't know.
Has your idea of Los Angeles changed since you've come to live here? And now that you're looking at it so continually and seriously?
Well, it's always fresh looking to me, always interesting. Architectural, it's forever interesting. Even you smile at architecture here, I like that. Well, it's changed. In some ways it's changed. For instance, when I lived, this was a recent change, I noticed this. When I lived in Santa Monica, or I lived on Pico Boulevard, everything was straight lines and cubes to me in Los Angeles. Mostly those were the forms that you saw. And then I went to live up on Mulholland Drive, and suddenly, every day I drove down Nichols Canyon to paint on Santa Monica Boulevard, and suddenly wiggly lines
so your work has been affected by your move to the hills.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that there were always these wiggly lines if you drive on Mulholland Drive. And suddenly then I began to notice that Los Angeles, you looked at it a bit like a map. It was also, I suddenly realized it was a city that everybody knows very well from the air, which is unusual in a sense that most people who travel in here, even if you come from San Francisco or San Diego, people fly in and you see the city very clearly when you fly in, even at night. You can recognize the streets. You can say that's Wilshire Boulevard or something. Well, you can't do that in a lot of other cities. Even in New York, you couldn't say that's Fifth Avenue. You can't look and you see it's Manhattan. In London, you can see landmarks, but you can't really say, oh, that's Kensington High Street. You can't do that. And I think then I realized, oh, it's another view. You can have another view completely of this city. And I started, at the moment, because I was painting on Santa Monica Boulevard, I painted a picture of Nichols Canyon, I painted a long picture of Mulholland Drive, and then I realized they were views from Santa Monica Boulevard, essentially. So now I want to paint them up there and see what happens. So you get another view of it then.
With all this enthusiasm, is it correct to assume that you consider yourself a Californian now?
Well, yeah, I've been here more than 3 months. If you've been here more than 3 months,
you qualify. We know that you're fascinated by the sun, but there is also a part of you that is drawn to the more gloomy environment of your upbringing. How does that get reflected in your work?
Well, I used to say it was, yes, the Mediterranean sun attracted me, and Gothic gloom, because I was brought up in Gothic gloom, really. You know, as I say, Bradford, it's a Victorian Gothic city, but outside of Bradford are all kind of Gothic ruins, you know.
It's not very far from London, though.
Well, it is and it isn't. It's 200 miles, but when I was a child, we didn't know anybody who'd been to London. It's a long way. My mother was 63 years old when she first visited London.
And your father?
My father went in the general strike, 1926, and he'd never been again.
Can we talk about your family for a moment? They are obviously very central, as one might imagine, to your life and your work. And in a rather generous way, you have used a term to describe your father that has a special meaning to you, and the word that you used to describe him was eccentric. I wonder if you can tell us what you mean by that phrase and how you were influenced by him.
Well, he was eccentric. I mean, I found that out because he was rather different from most other people on the street, or most other people's parents that I met. But he was also, like all eccentric people, they're very self-centered, of course. And he kind of lived in a world of his own. I mean, in the end he was a bit deaf, and again perhaps that drives you into a world, more a world of your own. But he was, his behaviour was eccentric in the sense that...
How did it manifest itself?
Well,
that in a way both influenced you, and I assume in some ways intimidated you, and in some ways liberated you.
Well, for instance, all I can do is illustrate with some stories. For instance, when I was, you have to remember it's a very cold, dark place, very cold, you know. And I must have been 8 or 9 years old. I'm walking down the street, and there's a telephone box near a school. And outside the telephone box there's a man sat in a chair, an easy chair, which is not a usual sight, you see. But as I got closer, I saw it was my father. So actually I said, well, what? It just looked as though he'd taken a bit of the living room and pushed it way up the street. And I said, well, why are you sitting here? And he said, oh, he was going to sell the billiard table. And he put in an ad in the newspaper to ring this number between 5:30 and 6, and it was the telephone box. He didn't have a phone, and rather than stand outside the phone box, thought he'd have to be there half an hour, so he'd actually wheeled.
Sounds very practical. Did he manage to
well,
sell the billiard table?
I thought, well, it all made sense to me, and then I carried on, and that was it. But it was explainable perfectly rationally. And I thought, well, it's a good idea, that's what I'd do, actually. Everybody else would think, oh, it's a bit daft. You know, they would have hid behind the phone box or something. And I don't know, there's hundreds of things. Really. I think, actually, would have liked to have been an artist, really.
What was his occupation? Was he an artist at any time himself?
He did many jobs. No, he was never really an artist. I mean, the last few years of his life he was a clerk, but he did study art and at night school, at the art school in Bradford, when he was young, because he must have studied it in a very, very, you know, old-fashioned academic way, because again, if you remember when the Royal Academy was selling their Leonardo drawing, do you remember a few years ago they sold it to the National Gallery, very beautiful drawing of a Virgin and Child, and it was reproduced in all the newspapers. And when my father saw it, he said, oh yeah, I know that. He said, I've done that. It's called Light and Shade. He used to take lessons in light and shade at art school, which I often think about afterwards, because I think, frankly, it's probably they never do it now. Yes. They would never do it now. But to learn about chiaroscuro is probably extremely good thing. In fact, I noticed in the Picasso show in New York, the first drawing, the first thing in the show was a drawing of a plaster cast that obviously he'd made. His father taught drawing, didn't he? And would have taught things like that. And I noticed how good he was
as a draftsman
at grasping volume through shade, through light and shade, which he must have been taught. And then you realise how it runs all the way through his work, how his cubism, where you used in analytical cubism, chiaroscuro, the idea, he used it better than Braque, I think. Again, it's somehow, I don't know, I suddenly thought, they should do light and shade classes again. That's what I thought.